it got that much bigger and that much brighter on the WNBA, and I'm really glad that she mentions it here. It's just Caitlin Clark. It's always been just Caitlin Clark. Yes, there are other great young players who have come into this league, but it has truly been the Caitlin.
The attendance numbers alone make the argument nearly impossible to refute. Before Clark arrived, the Indiana Fever ranked near the bottom of the league in attendance. In her rookie season, they jumped to first and stayed there. That kind of reversal doesn't happen organically. It happens when one athlete fundamentally changes demand. To contrast this with Angel Reese's arrival in Chicago, the Sky were already a top 3 attendance team before Reese joined. Afterward, they dropped into the bottom 5. This isn't a critique of Reese's talent. It's proof that not all stars move markets the same way. Television data tells a similar story. Iowa women's basketball maintained strong ratings even after Clark left, demonstrating that she created new fans rather than simply redirecting attention. The 2024 WNBA season shattered records across the board: attendance, viewership, engagement. Just months after Clark's draft, the WNBA finalized an 11-year, $2.2 billion media rights deal with Disney, Amazon Prime, and NBC Universal, roughly $200 million per year. The argues the timing isn't coincidental. Media executives watched Clark's impact unfold in real time and priced that future into the deal. Without that agreement, today's CBA negotiations would look entirely different. Salary demands, revenue sharing, and potential exclusivity clauses would be unrealistic. The financial base enabling those conversations exists because the league's value exploded, and that explosion traces back to Caitlin Clark. From facilities upgrades to practice complexes costing hundreds of millions, ownership is now investing like the WNBA is a profitable long-term enterprise. That belief didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built on the audience Clark delivered. In the end, Dodd's conclusion is unavoidable. Steady growth laid the groundwork, but Caitlin Clark lit the fuse. Everything else followed.
To talk about this ESPN article, and it's entitled WNBA CBA Negotiations at an Impasse, 11 Things That Got Us to This Point. And this was written by Alexa Filippo. She has been covering all things WNBA relentlessly, but I've seen a lot of discourse about a couple of things in this article, so I simply wanted to go over it.
To fully understand why Caitlin Clark's impact feels so dramatic, Rachel rewound the clock to January 2020. When the WNBA and the Players Association announced what they proudly labeled a revolutionary collective bargaining agreement. At the time, it was celebrated as a landmark victory for women's basketball. But when viewed through today's lens, that agreement tells a very different story. Under that so-called revolutionary deal, maximum salaries barely exceeded $200,000. For elite professional athletes competing at the highest level of their sport, that figure was closer to a solid corporate salary than true star compensation. Even more striking is that Caitlin Clark's rookie contract, signed under this system, paid roughly $76,000 per year. That wasn't an anomaly. It was standard. Fast forward just a few years, and the conversation has completely changed. Now we're hearing serious discussions about average salaries approaching $500,000, with top-tier contracts potentially surpassing $1 million annually. In barely 6 years, the league's entire financial framework flipped upside down. But here's the key distinction to emphasize. Most of that 6-year period featured steady, incremental growth, not transformational change. Attendance slowly improved. Viewership ticked upward. Sponsorships increased modestly. Encouraging signs, yes, but not enough to fundamentally alter the league's economic ceiling. At that time, alternative leagues like Unrivaled didn't exist. Athletes Unlimited wasn't offering meaningful domestic options. Project B wasn't even a concept. WNBA players still relied heavily on overseas contracts just to make a livable income. Travel conditions were poor. Training facilities were often substandard. Some teams practiced at public gyms simply because ownership couldn't afford better. The 2020 bubble season exposed these issues brutally. Compared to the NBA's environment, the WNBA's conditions looked underfunded and unprepared. Food quality, housing arrangements, and logistical support became public embarrassments after going viral online. That moment created serious tension between players and then Commissioner Kathy Engelbert, tension that never fully disappeared. This context matters because it highlights just how fragile the league's position still was only a few years ago. The growth was real, but the margin for error was thin. Without a dramatic shift in public interest and revenue potential, the league's long-term sustainability remained uncertain.
Here. Well, it started in January 2020. The WNBA and the WNBPA agreed to a groundbreaking CBA. And they announced this on January 14th, 2020, that they'd agreed to a groundbreaking and landmark collective bargaining agreement. Now, you see what the groundbreaking CBA was when Caitlin Clark is on a $70,000 per year deal. That at the time was groundbreaking for these players. So just to put that into perspective as the kind of money that they are they're talking about right now, average salaries around $500K to max salaries over $1 million. It was groundbreaking for them when a max salary was over $200,000.
Rachel recently laid out one of the most detailed and uncompromising breakdowns we've seen regarding the modern WNBA, and the conclusion she reached has reignited a debate many people are still uncomfortable having. She didn't rely on hype, emotional appeals, or vague narratives. Instead, she walked through the full timeline, the financial data, the business deals, and the audience metrics to show how one athlete dramatically altered the league's trajectory. According to her analysis, Caitlin Clark didn't just contribute to the WNBA's growth. She fundamentally transformed it from a struggling sports property into a billion-dollar media asset. What made Da's breakdown resonate was a refusal to sugarcoat the truth. She openly addressed why certain voices within the league hesitate to acknowledge Clark's role, even when the numbers make the case unavoidable. This wasn't about diminishing the contributions of other players or eras. It was about recognizing a turning point, an inflection moment where the league's visibility, valuation, and leverage suddenly exploded. The core question to raise, and the one fans are now arguing over, is simple but uncomfortable. Would the WNBA have secured a massive $2.2 billion media rights agreement if Caitlin Clark had not entered the league in 2024? Or was the league already on a guaranteed path toward that level of financial success regardless of her arrival? This question matters because it cuts through years of vague optimism and forces an honest assessment of cause and effect. The WNBA had been growing, yes, but growth alone doesn't automatically lead to seismic media deals. Networks don't invest billions based on hope or goodwill. They invest based on ratings, audience expansion, cultural relevance, and long-term profitability. To argue that Clark delivered all of that at once, and in a way no single player ever had before. What makes this debate even more divisive is that acknowledging Clark's impact challenges long-held narratives about collective progress versus individual influence. Some prefer to frame the WNBA's success as the inevitable result of decades of work. That doesn't dispute that foundation, but she insists foundations don't create explosions. Catalysts do. By presenting raw data instead of opinions, she effectively forced the conversation into the open. Fans, analysts, and players are now being asked to confront an uncomfortable reality. The league's biggest financial breakthrough may be directly tied to one athlete's arrival. Whether people accept that or resist, it says more about perspective than about the facts themselves.
In just 6 years. But I did want to point this out because prioritization, a new system requiring players to put the WNBA first ahead of overseas commitments, was also introduced. And this is something that I predict, maybe not this CBA, but probably the next one, if the salaries continue to rise, if they get that revenue split that they're asking for or something even close to that, it's going to be more than prioritization. It's going to
In February 2022, the WNBA announced a $75 million capital raise from outside investors, a move that initially sparked optimism but later introduced new complications. According to Rachel DeMita, this was a necessary decision at the time, even if it created long-term challenges that are now surfacing. Following the investment, league ownership was divided as follows: 42% controlled by the WNBA, 42% by the NBA, and 16% by the investor group. That 16% stake, which Cathy Engelbert authorized, is now a central issue in revenue-sharing negotiations. Profits are no longer divided simply between the league and its players. They must now be shared with third-party investors as well. Players today are pushing aggressively for a larger slice of league revenue. But to point out the problem, that revenue is being split more ways than ever before. While the capital raise injected much-needed cash, it also complicated future labor negotiations. Looking back, it admits she may have been overly critical of Engelbert's leadership in that moment. With hindsight, it's clear the league was in serious financial danger in 2022. That investment may have quite literally kept franchises alive. Without it, teams might have folded, downsized, or slashed operations even further. At the time, the WNBA didn't know what was coming. They didn't know a once-in-a-generation star was about to enter the league and change everything. Engelbert was making survival decisions, not growth bets. The uncomfortable truth to uncover is this: without that capital infusion, the league may not have survived long enough to benefit from Caitlin Clark's arrival. The investment stabilized operations, funded marketing initiatives, and kept infrastructure intact just long enough for the explosion that followed.
So this was when the capital raise was announced. A capital raise featuring new investors and existing WNBA and NBA owners brought in $75 million that was used to supercharge the WNBA's business growth, including better marketing and more innovation. And this is when we talk about the split, you guys, and why it's very hard for players to get more of a revenue share than what they're asking for. 42% of the WNBA is owned by the WNBA. 42% is owned by the
Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, and according to the transformation was instant. Not gradual, not seasonal, immediate. She compares it perfectly. The league went from being illuminated by a weak laser pointer to being blasted by a massive searchlight overnight. The attention spike was unlike anything the WNBA had ever experienced. Ticket demand surged. Media coverage exploded. Social media engagement skyrocketed. Clark didn't just attract existing fans. She brought in entirely new audiences who had never followed women's basketball before. This is what separates her impact from previous stars. Many great players increased interest within the league. Clark expanded the market itself. The stress is that this wasn't organic growth continuing its natural curve. This was a sharp vertical jump that changed how the league was perceived by broadcasters, sponsors, and investors. Suddenly, the WNBA wasn't a niche product with potential. It was a mainstream asset with measurable returns. And that perception shift is what made everything else possible.